Thank you for joining me, Terry, as we run through the Citrix Pooled licensing benefits.
Sure, no problems. Well, let's see what we can cover.
Fantastic. As an agenda, we've got introduction, application delivery manager for pooled, MPX perpetual to pooled conversion, SDX pooled conversion, VPX and vCPU pooled, and a summary at the end. Do you want to take this next one?
Yeah, hopefully you're going to be able to understand once the session's ended how ADM or Application Delivery Manager functions when it comes to the pool capacity. The conversion of the pooled, which is often a common ask. I've got a perpetual style license. I'm going to pooled. How does that actually work? And when we look at the CPU based conversion, how is that different? From a change control aspect or implementing it, then it's always nice to know if and when the appliances are going to need to be restarted.
I know certainly I've been burnt several times by the unknown needs of rebooting and whether we have to delay for change control.
The last thing you want is to have your change control all in place and suggested that you don't need to reboot, and halfway through you realise that now you actually do need to reboot.
Sounds excellent.
And then FAQ, some little nuggets.
So the basics, the pool capacity licensing, it's letting us share licenses amongst multiple ADCs. Those licenses are stored at a central location on ADM service. They generally come in two flavors, being bandwidth and vCPU. A bandwidth license comes with standard, enterprise, or premium feature sets. And you would purchase the amount of bandwidth that was required, and then you could carve it up such that you can allocate amounts of bandwidth in any particular feature set to ADCs across your entire enterprise. We'll have a demonstration of that shortly. Terry, can you tell us a little about vCPU or virtual CPU licensing?
If you think of our product range, we have a combination of virtual appliances and we have a combination of physical appliances. So when we look at CPU based, then that's where we look at our virtual technologies. So we're talking about the VPX instances that can run on cloud platforms as well as on internal hypervisors. And we're talking about the CPX or our container-based ADC. So if you think that VPX licensing is really for those customers that are not going to have physical appliances running ADCs, they're going to be utilizing it on their kit. Those licenses are allocated on boot. So in order to change that license, then you're going to need to shut down the instance, change the number of CPUs you've got allocated to that virtual machine, and then bring the virtual machine back up. And at which point, the pooled licensing will look at the virtual machine and suggest that, okay, the virtual machine had two CPUs, so we was utilizing two CPUs out of the pool. You've now shut the machine down, you've now brought the machine back up, and it's now got four CPUs. So therefore it will allocate four CPUs out of the pool. So this is where there's more of a change control process regarding CPU based. Now, one of the big advantages of CPU based licensing is that there's no capacity license. We will be utilizing the CPU's performance. So where previously, if you have bandwidth and instance and a VPX, and there's a VPX 10, and then we ramped it up to a VPX 2000 or 2 gig, you could in fact get more capacity out of the instance using CPU because there's no bandwidth limitations.
Next, we're going to share what I think is a great demonstration of how you can use pooled licensing's burst capability to dynamically scale out your ADC environment.
An example of how pooled licensing works. Here you can see that I've got my ADC running, bring your own license, just a very small instance. So you can see here that it's a premium, it's 10 meg of its licensing pooled. And what I have on that is just a couple of just test servers, really. This isn't a production, this is just my own lab for the purpose of demonstrating some of the functions that the pool capacity will give you that perhaps you wouldn't have if you had the traditional style licensing. You've got your ADC configured, you've got your back-end web server that's potentially going through that content switching or web application firewall functionality. And here it's a common known product for WebGoat, so just for testing, so like WAF rule bases, etc. And I've got it linked to our application delivery manager service. So this is pointing to the cloud-based service, just going into some of the analytics really. So looking at that analytics configuration, and then being able to, for the purpose of the information, just looking at the statistics. Now I've dived into a couple of the menus, so you can always pause the video just to understand where some of these menus are. But we're going to be looking at the live traffic that's going to be going through this. And to simulate that live traffic, what I have is a couple of benchmarking style tools on my MacBook. We'll wait for those to come up. You can see here that there's nothing going through. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a A/B or a benchmarking tool that's going to simulate a number of connections to that URL that I've got based on a content switch. So this is trying to simulate just production traffic or your traffic coming through at day to day. And what we should see is that once the benchmarking tool fires into action, it's just starting to go through the scenario.
It's a free tool, isn't it? Our customers should be able to download, do the exact same thing if they're following along.
Oh yeah, if they've got a MacBook, it's already built onto the OS. Linux, there's availability. I think there's even a Windows version. It runs off Apache engine. So we're starting to get the traffic going through our ADC. So you can see here that by simulating some traffic, I'm now getting the connections and my throughput starting to increase. And what you would have noticed is that I probably breached that 10 meg license that I had on my ADC. Because remember, right at the beginning, we had the 10 meg license that's just sitting there. And again, what I do is I just simulate a huge number of connections that are going to the ADC. And you can see it's hitting 500 connections. We've got a number of transactions. We've got the throughput starting to impact the ADC. But from a connectivity aspect, well, what you'd normally expect is drop traffic. As soon as you hit the license limit, then our ADCs will throttle or control based on the license value. And at which point you should start to get some platform errors, potentially saying that you're dropping connectivity purely because of licensing. So we just push some more of that.
That's well above and beyond.
That's right. And this is the scenario that some people or some companies may actually have, which is that those peak demands, it might be over a weekend period, it could be evenings, it could be anything, where you don't realize until the next day, well, what actually happened? Or why was it that our web server got really busy? What was the demand on that? But the main thing is that you want to try and continue servicing content, because if you don't service the content, then what's going to happen is that you're going to have users being impacted. It could be your customer's customer being impacted as well. So if it's an online e-commerce site, it could be a local authority site, it could be anything that potentially you're getting revenue from. Then the last thing you want is impacted service based on, it was running at the incorrect size license. What we will see should be where pooled licensing really comes into its own, which is that it should provide that initial burst capacity, but based on an alert scenario, what we can actually then do is upgrade the license that the ADC is running.
I used to buy my co-located server bandwidth in a similar way to this. I would say 95th percentile, this is what I need. but periodically I might burst to much higher levels. Is it like that?
You've got a license key, a license bandwidth allocated to your ADC. But remember, your pooled capacity could be a lot bigger. So what you're doing is you're upgrading the license so that, in fact, it's now stepping up that license to a value that you're aware of. So you'll notice that it's taken the bandwidth from 10 megabits to 2 gigabits based on an alert and based on a configuration job. So this is a once only, because where I find it is a case of, and you may agree, you may disagree, but it's a case of taking a license value up and utilizing your pool is great. But what you don't want to do is start then taking it back down, because you can get into that scenario where you're now impacting service by dropping the license key. And the way that we're using this is looking at SNMP alerts. And you can see here that I'm picking out the platform rate limit alert, which is an alert that we have available on our ADC. And then stating that if we have this alert be generated, then on that instance, run a configuration job or an event rule. And what that event rule will be doing is it will be stating that go and upgrade the license key to a fixed value. So in this scenario, what we've said is that it's from a 10 meg, and if we get the alert, then therefore take it up to 2 gig. In a live environment, it may be a case of what you'll be doing is you'll be sitting there saying, well, it's running a gig. I'm going to take it up to 2 gig, or I might take it up to 1.5, just so that you know that you've stepped up that license.
So presumably, if I was a service provider, I could sell my customers, maybe even internal customers, a certain amount of bandwidth and charge it back to them. And then if they started to breach that for a period, I could step it up as you've suggested and offer them the opportunity to purchase more licensing. And if they wanted it, fantastic, we'll make it permanent. And if they didn't, we can put it back down again.
Exactly. Yeah. And what you do is you put it back down again as a controlled process. So you wouldn't dynamically take it up and then take it back down. The ideal scenario is you take it up, and then at that point you can then have your business as usual, your BAU, server team, networking team, review that in fact it's been raised, and then understand, well, whether in fact that was a one-off scenario, or it could be a case of reviewing it and then stating that in fact it had the wrong license in the first place, and really it shouldn't have been a VPX with 10 meg, it should have been a VPX with perhaps 1 gig.
Presumably that's going to give quite a lot of benefits to purchasing your licenses as well. And thinking that you wouldn't have to start off by saying, we'll buy large licenses everywhere. You could start off by buying a pool and then allocating the pool where it was necessary to use it.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the advantages of having a pool is that each appliance, when we talk physical appliances, they will have a minimum threshold that the appliances have to have. So they'll have to run so many gigabits of throughput, and they have to run so many instances on that platform. But then above and beyond that capacity, in your scenario that you have a pool of capacity, and you will have a percentage of that pool that potentially is known as almost like floating capacity. You could utilize that wherever you wanted to.
Let's take a look at the connectivity. Now, as I understand it, we've got application delivery management, ADM, which can run as a service sitting in Citrix's cloud. And then in order to link our ADCs, wherever they might be in the world, different data centers, perhaps we can have several data centers connected, running in Amazon, running in Azure, different cloud environments. When we want all of those to connect back to ADM service, we do so using agents. And those agents would be deployed either in the cloud or on premises. And the agent's purpose would be to facilitate that communication from each of the ADCs, collect various pieces of analytical data, statistical data about the ADCs being used, and of course to provide the licensing capabilities back and forth through to the cloud service so that what we don't have is each of the ADCs individually trying to make that connection.
Yeah, that's just right. So it's a case of you have that capability so that the ADM agents play a key role in this architecture because they are the communication points externally to the ADM service.
Here, we've got individual fixed licenses across the entire estate. And if we take all of those, we can migrate them into a single pooled set of licensing. As that pooled set of licenses now lives up in the cloud, we've got a single cloud-based resource that we can draw upon. So no longer do we have an MPX, which is sitting in data center 1 with a large amount of bandwidth licensing, and another MPX with not enough licensing, perhaps in data center 2. Now we've got the ability to draw for both MPXs from that singular pool and allocate the amount of licensing which is required at the time. Now, as the business changes and moves, we might find ourselves in a position where we don't want to have as much on those MPXs at all. We want to move away from them, perhaps. We want to have virtual ADCs, VPXs, and we might take some of the bandwidth previously on the MPX platforms, and we might go and allocate it to VPXs. And perhaps those VPXs aren't in data center 1 or 2 at all. Perhaps they're sitting in Amazon or Azure cloud environments.
I fully agree with that one because it is a case of it removes that scenario where you've purchased an appliance and you're not using all of the capacity of that appliance.
That gives great flexibility. The idea that you can move the capacity between hardware and virtual platforms as you need to. Perhaps if you find yourself with a huge rush on Black Friday, you might be thinking we need to fire up new platforms, new environments, and to have the capability to be able to dynamically stand them up and allocate the licenses where they're needed must be superb, especially when we consider that we could be doing that by expanding into the cloud if it was necessary. But what about economics? Terry, how does it help?
The ideal way of doing that is actually using the capacity or the products that you have. So, for example, if you're using our appliances and you've got spare capacity and you need to perhaps go to a cloud platform or you need to bring up a test dev environment or perhaps a DR scenario, which is not really on, but you want it to be perhaps a warm standby, you want it available, but not at the full capacity, then this is where your dynamic allocation comes in. It means that you're now utilizing the licenses that you own and potentially purchasing less licensing because of you're only purchasing what you need. The other scenario is that, and I touched on it, the DR or business continuity, or we've got it as a follow the sun scenario, which is a case of you've got environments that they're not production, then they're not servicing traffic. But when they do start to service traffic, you want to have them utilize the licensing that you have. You don't really want to have lots of licensing in your environment that you're paying for, you're maintaining, that's never used. And then that scale up, scale down scenario, which I talked about at the beginning, which is a case of those peak demands that you're able to cover based on your pool of licensing.
So, a use case, migration from on-prem to the cloud, flexibly shifting capacity to the cloud of your choice. As we talked about, the pool does sit in the cloud in ADM service. And as a consequence to that, you're able to draw on that pool from wherever your ADCs may be.
Yeah, you're completely correct. And when we look at the licensing components of this, and now we're starting to delve into potentially not some of the benefits, but let's look at the individual components. You'll notice here, and Stephen, you spent a number of years deploying this. So you'll recognize the shift in licensing, and now we've got multiple licenses to do the same functionality.
Very much so. When I first started fitting ADCs, it was very much a focus on MPXs. And that seemed to change over the years to people fitting more and more virtual ADCs, VPXs. Then, of course, I see the CPX environments, containerized, starting to come out for Kubernetes. But this Z license, is that the zero capacity? So you're buying a hardware platform that doesn't contain licenses for the specific purposes of using the pool? Or is that something else?
No, that's exactly the correct scenario. And you'll notice the Z platform, or the zero capacity platform license, and it's only available for our physical appliances. So our SDX multi-tenanted platform, as well as our MPX, which is a single instance platform. And what this is doing is actually opening up the ability for pooled licensing to be used on those platforms. Because if you look at the MPX, for example, normally you would have one license that goes on an MPX, and that would have the edition and the version. So on a 59 series, you might have a 5901 premium edition appliance, and that would all be one license key, and it may be a 1 gig license. And then if you wanted to upgrade that, then you might have to change that license to be a 5910 for 10 gig premium edition, and that would all be in one license key. The zero capacity just means that the appliances are now sitting there saying, I've got a license, which means that I'm going to be utilizing pool capacity. And at which point, that's the only license that sits on the appliance. Then you have the instance and the bandwidth, which are dynamic allocations, and they sit in ADM. So if you think about this, instance and bandwidth are allocated to ADM, and then the zero capacity are the platform licenses. And this will be a change from traditional style license.
ADM and pool capacity. For those who haven't used ADM service before, ADM service provides you the capability of managing your licenses from a single centralized cloud point.
This is where it changes, because normally when you allocate licensing, the host ID would have been the physical ADC. But when you go to ADM, ADM has its own host ID, and this is where you allocate the licenses. So the bandwidth and instance licenses now get allocated to the host ID of ADM.
So you would allocate your licenses now to ADM service. You would download those licenses, install them into ADM, and then presumably any ADC could draw upon them regardless of the ADC's host ID.
Correct, because what the licensing is actually doing, and on the previous slide, you noticed that the physical boxes have got the zero capacity license. So they've got their own license, and the virtual instances they don't now need their own host ID. They're not really utilizing that host ID for licensing purposes. They're going to be almost pointing at a remote license server, and the remote license server is ADM.
Now, I can see on the upper right-hand side of this slide, we've got a number of different pools of licenses that I could draw from. Now, I understand that those need to have the same expiry date on them, so they do form a single pool.
So it's a case of, you will be buying standard edition, advanced edition, premium edition, but this will be the pool of capacity. Instances are separate from the pool. So you can buy 5, 10, 15, 20 instances. So if you've got an MPX, that's one instance. An SDX, that can run multiple instances. A VPX would be one instance. A CPX would be one instance. So it's exactly the same scenario. But when you allocate the bandwidth is allocated to the version. So you would buy a bandwidth capacity at a specific version. So you would say, can I have 10 gigs worth of bandwidth at a premium level? And then that will go into the premium level pot. Can I have 10 gigs worth of advanced bandwidth? And then that will go into the advanced bandwidth pot. So pots are the addition and the bandwidth. So you can't ask for bandwidth from another pot, but you can change the additions. So if you say, well, I've got a standard, and I've got a pot for that, and I've allocated it to a machine, but really I need to do some AAA auth, some GSLB. Okay, I need to now change that to use the advanced edition pot, or on the scenario of, okay, fine, I'm putting in some services and I need to do some web application firewall or bot management protection of that service. I need to go to premium. Then again, you can change that edition to say, well, can I use the premium edition pot? And at which point then it will open up the features and the functionality associated to that.
I see. So I would buy a shared set of instances that I could boot up pretty much anywhere I wanted. And then depending on the amount of bandwidth of the feature set that I wanted, I would buy the right allocations. And later, if I decided I needed to move from enterprise to premium, then I would just get my virtual machine, my VPX, whatever it might be, to move from one bandwidth pool to the other by changing the CLI command. Yes?
Yeah. You can do it via CLI, or you can do it via the console. And the way you would do that is you actually release the current allocation of license. You then reallocate to the correct pool. And then at which point there will be a restart that will be required. And then at which point, when it restarts, it's going to pick up the correct edition. Now, the one thing to bear in mind is that if this is part of a HA scenario, then I would always suggest do the passive node first. But both nodes in a HA need to be the same edition. So you don't have a node that's on advanced and a node that's on the enterprise or premium.
Okay. So let's take a look at the allocation behavior. Provisioning steps for ADM. We want to download the capacity license file, and then we want to upload that capacity license file into the ADM service environment. After we've done that, we'd want to ensure that we had ADM agents deployed at our various locations. And once we've got ADM agents and we've got connectivity from the ADCs back to ADM service, that's going to allow us to check out licenses on each of those devices and dynamically scale them up and down, as previously mentioned, based on rules, or alternatively, to put a static allocation onto the devices.
Correct. And once a license is allocated to the ADC instance, then you can change the allocation through the licensing options or through a command line, or you can even do that through ADM. The screenshot there is we're using the pool for advanced edition, and at which point that's where it states, oh, I've got X number of instances available, and from a bandwidth allocation, I've got X number of bandwidth associated to the advanced edition pool.
Taking a look at ADM's operating modes, if we allocate licenses to a particular ADC, we should see the license status, which is highlighted in a red box in the middle of that screenshot in the upper right-hand side. And we can see there that the license status could be optimum, capacity mismatched, grace. What we should be seeing here is that the licenses are available, the licenses are allocated to the device, and we're going to receive alerts within ADM service. If we lost connectivity and one of the ADCs went into a grace mode where we had a 30-day period to get it back connected to ADM service, perhaps by rebooting the agent or finding out what's gone wrong in our hypervisor estate, then we're going to get SNMP alerts for that. We're going to get alarms which are sent out via ADM service, and we're going to get notifications.
And the other thing is visually, when you log into your ADC, if you've gone into a grace period, then you'll get like a yellow banner that's at the top of the GUI, and it will tick down from 720 hours. So you will get visibility not only via alerts, but graphically when you log into your ADCs. The other thing is on the graphic on the right-hand side, just about see it, but there's an actions option, and that's where you can dynamically change the allocation as well. So if you wanted to change ADM from a 1 gig to a 2 gig, then you can dynamically change it there.
Let's take a look at the MPX conversion to pooled process. We've got an MPX, I say Z, but I'm aware our US colleagues would say Z. So MPX Z platform license. It's the pooled capacity enablement license for the MPX. Once we install this pooled capacity license, this will allow us to consume premium, advanced, or standard edition licenses from ADM service as opposed to having a local license installed, which had a locked in amount of bandwidth onto that individual appliance.
You'll notice that there's a minimum amount of bandwidth that needs to be allocated to the appliance. And then after that, it's floating capacity. So basically, this is where the pool capacity comes in. For example, if I pick the MPX 8900Z appliance, so the 89,000 series appliances, they've got a maximum capacity of 33 gigs. The minimum that edition can run is 5 gig. However, you'll notice that the minimum bandwidth unit is 1 gig. So that's how much I can step the capacity up by. So if I wanted to add additional capacity to my 89,000 series, traditionally I would have had to have gone from an 8910 to an 8920 to an 8930, etc. So I would have had to make big jumps. Now with pool capacity, I could run an 89,000 series with only 5 gigs worth of bandwidth. And then if I wanted to upgrade it, I would upgrade it to 6 gig, 7 gig, 8 gig, etc. And that's the same with all of the appliances. So what it does mean is that this is where it really shows the flexibility, because now I'm not locked into an addition with an appliance allocation. I just have to make sure that my appliances are running the minimum, and then anything above the minimum I'm taking from the pool.
And can I convert? If I'm an existing customer, I've got a large number of appliances already, maybe with capacity locked up in data centers where I don't need it. Do I have to buy entirely new appliances?
A lot of the appliances are probably going end of life. Some of the older appliances will have the capacity to do this conversion. However, we may find that by the time people are reviewing this, then they're already looking at replacement appliances, and all of the replacement appliances support this.
So MPX-Z is the platform license that enabled the pooled capacity on the MPX. We can dynamically modify the bandwidth, which I think is what you were demonstrating in your video at the beginning. So I could have bought an MPX and then dynamically scaled out the bandwidth that was available to me, even during particular sessions without any outages. Restarts are required. That's as if I'm changing the license edition. I think that's if I'm moving standard, enterprise, premium. Is that right?
Yeah, plus also if you're changing from perpetual license to pooled.
Ah, yes. So if we've got an existing customer and they want to move, is it that easy? Do we change the license server? We change the license entitlement, reboot, obviously under change control, reboot, and everything should continue working?
Yeah, so what should happen is that when you go through this process, and this is where I suggest doing the high availability, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be applying the license and then allocating the addition. And then on a restart, what will happen is it will check into that license. So if you click onto the next slide, I think we've actually got a screenshot which demonstrates that. So for example, here it's a case of MPX requires 2 reboot. So 1 reboot for the license conversion from perpetual to pooled. So that's a soft reboot, and then a full reboot when we actually ask it to do a standard, advanced and premium. And from a HA aspect, yes, you would do the HA appliances in a similar sort of process. And you can see there that the zero capacity license has been added, and now the appliance is asking to be restarted.
So if I provided some type of service, this is just a case of upgrading the secondary node to the new licensing mechanism, doing an HA failover to promote that into production, and then doing the other node. You might see TCP sessions drop, depending on how you've configured your HA environment, but that should be milliseconds, and all of the clients should immediately reconnect. So for intents and purposes, there would be no outage while I did this conversion. Is that right?
Yeah, you're quite correct. That's why the facility for HA is key in this sort of scenario, because it's reducing service interruptions.
Let's take a look at SDX conversion. So again, SDX-Z is the pooled capacity license enabling the SDX. As we talked about previously, we had the bandwidth in pools of premium, advanced, or standard. And we need to be running a fairly recent version of firmware in order to do this. This must give a huge amount of flexibility in an SDX environment.
Yeah, and again, referencing a similar table, really show the power. And SDX platforms are one that's almost designed for pull, if you think about it. If I pick the 14,000 Series Z appliance, the 14,000 series can go up to 100 gigs worth of throughput. And the instances were 14, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, etc. So there were big jumps that you were making for that. The other thing is that it supported a certain number of instances. And then when you went through the additions, then they came with more instances. So again, you were making jumps through product numbers. Where when we look at the pooled capacity, then the 14,000 series only needs to run 10 gigs on that box. Now, the minimum that perhaps a starter pool might be for that might be 20. So you'd already get 10 gigs worth of floating capacity. But when you look at the instances, it only needs to run 2 instances, but has a maximum of 25. So again, it's a case of any licensing that you have above and beyond 10 gigs worth of traffic and 2 instances now becomes portable, becomes floating. It becomes this pool capacity, which you could use to service other appliances that are connected to pooled. You could utilize this to perhaps bring up some VPXs on a cloud-based platform or an internal-based system. So therefore, going back to the previous slides where we talked about the economics, it's really unlocking the licensing purchased so that when you say that you've consumed your licensing and you need to go to the business and ask for some more instances of some more capacity, the business can be quite comfortable in the scenario of, yeah, you've got the pool capacity, so we're presuming that you're maxing out that pool.
I would think this probably helps for chargebacks as well. I've got quite a few customers who will bill projects for the amount of platform that they use. And if you were consolidating onto some larger appliances, or even you were removing things from large appliances and moving to a cloud environment, being able to say that project pays for X, we can now put that X wherever it's most sensible for us to put it as a business. That's got to give great flexibility.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's take a look at bandwidth changes. The SDX-Z is the platform licensing enabling pooled. You can dynamically modify the bandwidth without a restart, very much in the same way as you could have done that on an MPX environment. You can also modify the instances without a restart, which is exactly what you would expect to do if you had a non-SDX hosted environment. And once again, the restart is needed really if you're moving from standard to enterprise or enterprise to premium, or indeed in the opposite direction. You can increase and decrease the bandwidth at runtime without affecting any of the traffic.
When you look at the SDX and some of the changes, especially when you compare it to the MPXs, the SDX does not require a reboot. So that's a key function. So that's part of your change control. Obviously, full reboots are for the additions, which goes across anything. HA appliances, again, with the pool capacity, working exactly the same process. And each ADC appliance in the HA pair needs to have its own similar license. So it's exactly the same operation. I think the key thing is that just understanding that the SDX doesn't need a reboot, but the VPXs will when you change the additions and do the licensing.
You know, that's a common thing I used to discuss with people a lot in CCS. People get really hung up on this needs to have the same license for HA. It's probably worth noting that what you don't get by having different licenses is you don't get configuration synchronization. You still get failover. So if you have 2 VPX instances or 2 MPX instances, and you go and change the license on one of the two, HA will still work. If that primary node dies, the secondary will immediately take over and HA will work as usual. What you won't have is you won't have synchronization of the configuration. So you would do this under a change freeze, but you're not having to explain to the business, oh, we've lost HA while we do this. We're doing work on the HA node. No. HA stays. It's simply that we need a config freeze while the licenses differ.
So, for example, you do a change control, you want to make sure your pooled licensing is happy for a couple of days, etc. It's just ensure that from the pool of capacity, you allocate the same amount as you would do on a perpetual license, because you wouldn't want a failover and suddenly you was running a 3 gig appliance on the active node and a 200 meg on the passive node.
So this isn't licensed yet at all. This is just a standard Azure VPX booted straight up with nothing installed, right?
Yeah, that's correct. One thing that I will touch upon is the bring your own license aspect, because if you're going to be utilizing Citrix ADCs in Azure or any cloud platform, then use the bring your own license option if you've got pooled licensing capacity. The reason is because the ADC instance is associated to the cloud billing engine. So if you was to say bring your own license, you only get billed for compute. If you are utilizing, say, a VPX 1000 that you purchase from cloud, then what happens is that will utilize a different billing engine, and you would be paying for the license as well as the compute. So that's just one note. But in the background, what you've seen with ADM is that we've just been assigning the profile, allocating the ADC to ADM. So we would have gone through, allocated a profile, assigned it to an agent, and we discussed it earlier, how that communication works. And then the agent is now just reaching out locally to an ADC that it sees on its internal network, and then establishing that connectivity. So what we end up is that we end up with the ADC now within ADM service. It's available. We can now go to things like dashboards. We can look at the configuration. It's all intents and purposes a managed instance.
So that's quite cool, right? Because I could have taken a license that I'd originally intended to use on an SDX and decided instead I'm going to take that license allocation and I'm going to go and put that inside of Azure now.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and it has a big impact when it comes to cost. Because if you're not paying for licensing through a cloud provider, you're utilizing your own pooled licensing, then again, the economics kicks in. So here we've got the pool capacity licensing, and you can see here that we've got bandwidth allocation for premium, we've got instances, and we've got some premium vCPU based licensing. And that's where we've uploaded the license keys to our ADM service using the host file, the host ID of ADM service instance. And now you can see we've got the consoles. So back on our ADC, we need to allocate a license. And this is where we choose remote licensing mode. This is for pool capacity. So we're saying, are we using CPU based? Are we using check-in, check-out, which again is available? Or are we going to be using pooled, as in bandwidth and instance? We point this at our local ADM agent, because the agent is that middle ground, because the ADC is going to talk to the agent. So we're now going to be pointing at the agent, and you can see here that we're utilizing a profile that we've already got configured to just validate that connection. So that's the connection details. So
I can interject there, Terry. It's possibly also worth mentioning that this can be done automated, both through the CLI, as in logging into a device and typing the commands in, but it can also be done as a configuration job. So if I had booted up a couple of thousand ADCs, but I didn't want to sit there and log into the GUI in each and every one of them, or indeed do this on ADM's GUI, I could very easily go and set the license server using a configuration job and just apply it to all of my ADCs in one go.
The screen just showed an error management server. That's just a timeout error. It's where the GUI responded before actually the screen had made the connection. But now you can see that I'm now talking to the pool of licenses, and I've allocated from the premium edition the amount of licensing that I want, do a warm reboot, and at which point what we're having is we're having our ADC just do that quick reboot to pick up the new licensing. So once that's picked up the new licensing, what we will then be able to see is that we've got our ADC still being managed, but then we will start to look at the licensing functionality to see that it's picked up. So you can see here that my new one is the top line. It's allocated some licensing that we've got. So we just wait for the reboot to kick in.
While that's waiting for the reboot, I guess it's probably worth mentioning again that if you had two ADCs running in HA, that you would have a change freeze, and then it would just be a failover. You would do this on the secondary node as you made the conversion to pools. And then, of course, you would do a failover once you knew that node had the correct new licensing on it. And all the users would see is they would see an HA failover, which could be milliseconds worth of outage as opposed to that reboot type that we're busy waiting for. That would be the secondary node rebooting in the background with no impact on our users.
So that's ADC02 is the new box. You can see that it's gone straight into a grace period because it's still restarting. But it's already made that connection. It's already got the 1 gig allocated from a licensing aspect. So not only got our ADCs being managed by ADM, but we've now got the licensing being provided by ADM service as well. So when we log into the appliance, it's still a bring your own license, but we've now got the premium edition or the platinum edition. I believe that's now changed. The premium edition licensing. We're using a 1 gig throughput. Most importantly, it's still saying bring your own license because for a billing aspect, we're only being billed from Azure for the instance. So the instance type and when it's up and running. So reducing the costs impacting the business. And we've got the connectivity to the agent. And we can see here that we've got the licensing allocated. Change licensing options are available. So again, if we wanted to change that capacity, could do on the fly. So again, it's a case of changing that. Now, one of the things to mention on that changing of allocation is that do be aware that the compute that the VPX has only got a finite now amount of capacity that it's able to allocate and manage. Yeah. If you've got a 2 CPU appliance, don't try and put 5 gigs worth of throughput through it because it's not going to work. It's a case of make sure that the ADC has got enough compute. So if it's going to have anywhere between 1 and 3 gigs worth of capacity throughput that you're going to be pushing through this box, then do make sure that it's got at least 4 CPUs, the instance. Just bear in mind that although we've got given you the capacity to dynamically change it, it does rely on the underlying compute.
Sounds like increase the resources at the same time we increase the bandwidth. Which I guess is kind of expected, right? I mean, if you wanted to start processing 10 times the amount of traffic, it sounds kind of reasonable that you would increase the amount of resources available to the platform. Finally, let's cover some design and administration nuggets. HA scenarios, as we have previously mentioned, will use a double allocation from the pool. The reason for that, of course, is that we'll be making allocation on both the primary and the secondary node. Z, as I would say, or Z licenses are required for each of the hardware platforms. There's a unique platform license, which is required for both of the MPXs and the SDXs. And the licensing allocation must be completed in the licensing portal. For the license allocation, we would be using the Citrix license portal, and we would expect to have a host ID, which was unique within ADM service for each subscriber. And finally, verifying the MPX and SDX conversion support and model, which is a question of talking to your friendly systems engineer or account manager.
Yep, definitely.
You have agents connecting back to ADM service, and you can have those agents running on premises, inside of cloud environments, multiple data centers, wherever you wish. Each of those agents connects your ADCs back to ADM service and enables them to share licensing globally.
So this is where we talk about hybrid multi-cloud or multi-port environments. So for example, you've got the ADCs that are sitting on premise. There's perhaps sitting in an IaaS, they're sitting in Azure, there might be in AWS, GCP. So you've got deployments in multiple different infrastructure or data centers or locations. So you've got hybrid multi-cloud. So you utilizing multiple different environments. And for that, allowing for bandwidth on MPXs and CPXs on VPXs. Again, you just need to decide the pooled licensing capacity and versions. So if you've never had any physical appliances of ours, then you could quite simply go CPU based. However, if you decided, no, so what, I've got physical as well as virtual, then potentially bandwidth and instance would be the better suit for you. So just looking at the types of appliances you're going to be running and then reviewing the licensing options. And again, if there's any concerns or questions, then reach out to ourselves and I'm sure we'll be able to go through that.
If you've purchased pooled licensing, you won't need to go into My Citrix, download the licenses, export it, and move it into ADM service. You've still got the option to do that, but you also have an automatic import function.
Yeah.
And finally, there is an agent there is an agent on each of the ADCs, which you can enable and make direct connections with. That doesn't currently support pooled licensing, but I hear that may be coming in the future.
The connect functionality that ADCs have now, it gives us the ability to link to ADM service for the dedicated management sort of functionality. Can I get visibility? Can I see the ADC in ADM? Can I just get to the dashboard? Can I view some stats? But from the pooled licensing aspect, then there's still the requirement for the agents at the moment.
Superb. That brings us to the end of our webinar video. If you have any questions, then please get in touch.